just for the tape and for everyone knows, this is February 5th, 2012. Still wanted me to make sure I say that. And where we are is at the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library series, sponsored by ICSS. We're here every Sunday morning. We're a group that believes in having a fullest discussion from all different tendencies and all different ideas to engage the movement and see if we can break with this horrible capitalism. Our special speaker today is Knabb, who is the translator of many works and writings. You can see him up here. He has I have read this one in particular, which I recommend. And he's been very active in the Occupy movement and written a piece called The Awakening. It's in Slingshot back there and the publication back there. And there's if you're interested, there's an essay on the Situationists in my newspaper, News and Letters, back there. And what we want to do is turn the floor over to Ken and have a full discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over. Thank you, Ken, for being here.
Cell phones off.
Thank you for coming. I just lost my notes, but I think I have. I think somebody took them thinking they were a leaflet. So if you get home, you may find. Anyway, I think I can manage. I want to thank you for coming and for everybody that made this possible. I'm going to keep my talk brief. I think usually they say people talk an hour and then have an hour of questions or something. I'm going to aim more at something like half hour because I think that questions and answers will probably be more fruitful. So just to kind of set the stage, I'm going to talk about the Situationists and the Occupy movement, as you know. And most of you are very familiar with the Occupy movement, so I won't have to say too much about that in advance. Some of you may not be too familiar with the Situationists, so I'm going to talk about them a little bit. And then after that, we can kind of see what connection this might have. Maybe before doing that, I can kind of put myself in context. I discovered the Situationists back in 1969, 70 in that area, and was very struck by them, and met some people and started experimenting with my own Situationist type of agitations and so on, as I understood it, which was only partially. Hi, Patrick. Ended up going to France to meet them. Started learning French so that I could read their writings, most of which were not available in English. And eventually ended up going to France many times, and my French got better so that I could translate things. So I've done a lot of translations, and some of my own writings and other projects were inspired by them. And even though there are little differences, mostly I'm pretty much in agreement with what they said and did. So the Situationists started in Europe in the early 50s as an avant-garde tendency, issuing out of things like surrealism and Dadaism after World War II. And where the name Situationists comes from is that the Situationists looked back on surrealism and Dadaism and felt that these movements, which had started out with revolutionary intentions, both of them very explicitly wanted to change the world, had ended up being in museums or on the walls of rich people or so on. And they the Situationists attributed the failure to the fact that these movements had still remained within the art context. Even though they were sort of on the cutting edge of it, they were still painting pictures that had a frame around them, or doing things that had a metaphorical frame around them. This is something that takes place in a certain time or space, and then it's over. And so the Situationists said, rather than create works of art, we want to create situations. The situation being a kind of hypothetical thing that did not have boundaries. It would start out, but it would keep spreading and triggering other situations and so on. So when they founded the Situationist International in 1957, the Situationist aspect referred to that. The International, they were obviously hearkening on the First International and so on, the Revolutionary International groups. So from where they started out was this personal, cultural standpoint rather than political. The political was simply the result, the implication. It was the first thing is, I want to liberate myself. We want to liberate ourselves. Here we are right now. What are we going to do? And it's just the if you want to liberate yourself, they thought, you need companions. You don't do it by yourself. And even if you have some companions, you're going to run up against obstacles. If you say, let's see what we want to do with this city block, with this building, with this space, obviously you're going to run up against the property system, the different kind of customs that people have. You'll run up against the fact that most people are walking around kind of like sleepwalkers and so on. And so it's just the implication of that their own liberation meant that everybody has to be liberated. And when you look around to see how can that be done, then you enter the political realm and you say, well, what happened? There have been other people trying to do this, obviously, for centuries. And we can even look back and say that at certain points, we have a little hint of something like this happening. The Paris Commune or various revolutions in the early 20th century. And none of them succeeded. And so then you start looking like, well, why didn't they succeed? And trying to figure out, like the Russian Revolution seemed promising at first. But it turned out to be a disaster. So what was the problem there? The Spanish Revolution seemed very promising, and it was crushed, so you can't exactly say they were doing something wrong. It was just overpowered. Anyway, they started looking back at these things and trying to piece out what went wrong, what is still a valid type of tactic. And I'm not going to go into detail about their evolution, but in general, they came to the conclusion after a few years that they wanted a society of total self-management, a total democracy that would overthrow capitalism, that was totally obvious, but would do so in a manner that was anti-authoritarian, anti-state, that they attributed the failure of the Russian Revolution and the follow-ups to the vanguard party notion that you had a bureaucracy that would need to lead the revolution, and that it ends up turning into a bureaucracy that leads that heads up the state, and so on, which I'm not going to go into in detail. But so while maintaining their personal or cultural standpoint, they had this radical political perspective also, with workers' councils, popular assemblies, and so on, being things that they would, wildcat strikes, being the sorts of things that they thought were promising. And so if we fast forward ahead a little bit, in 1966, they had a scandal at the University of Strasbourg in France that I can't go into detail, but it brought them above the radar. It was such that there was a little pamphlet called On the Poverty of Student Life that came out of it that was reprinted in tens of thousands of copies all over France. It made headlines all over Europe because this was, somebody had done this coup at Strasbourg that nobody knew how to pigeonhole it. What's going on here? And the gist of it was that these situationist theses and tactics were being expressed for the first time on a massive scale. And as a result of that, in part, a year and a half later, in May 1968, in France, we had one of the major upheavals of modern times. And most of the people who were knowledgeable participants in that attributed a lot of the influence to the Situationists. And when you see the graffiti that was done by thousands there, you'll see a lot of the graffiti is just quotes out of these books. And things that a month earlier people had said, oh, this is impossible to understand. This is weird, Hegelian, Marxist, surrealist, something or other. We don't know what it is. And then in a different situation comes up, suddenly it's on the wall, and people know, yes, that's it. Because it's not just a question of understanding in a kind of intellectual way. It has to do with your own kind of orientation, or if you are actively engaged in something, you're experimenting with something, then these things from previous revolts, from previous struggles, suddenly take on a new meaning. You can see what they mean. You can see them more practically, like, can I use this? Well, yes or no. Okay, take what you can use. Leave aside the rest. We're not interested in giving credit to this or whatever. Just what the Situationists call literary communism, total plagiarism. So I'm going to tell you a little bit what happened in May '68, and here you'll start seeing some things that will sound familiar with the Occupy movement, and some things that are different. It's a rather different situation, but there are some overlaps. In early '68, a little group called the Enragés of students, but they were bad students, students who were in grad school for, as they termed it, the best the schools have to offer, grants. And so they were engaged in some class disruptions, leafleting of different sorts, but in ways that challenged the left as well as the right. Brought in some of the same kind of themes that the Situationists had been talking about the preceding 10 years. And in fact, they were very specifically influenced by the Situationists. So this agitation touched off in ways that I won't go in detail other agitations. You may have heard about the March 22nd movement. That was more well known. That was kind of a more timid offshoot of the Enragés. And this went on for a couple months, where more and more things were going on within the university that were becoming more and more scandalous. And at a certain point, some of the students were kicked out of the university by the university, and there may have been a few of them arrested, I forget, and there were this provoked a large demonstration in early May, and the way in which the Enragés had set this up was such that it quickly went beyond just students. And there were huge crowds of people protesting against the disciplining of these students, and this segued into street fighting. And this might sound kind of weird, like who would have predicted this? Usually student things stay within the university and so on. And I won't go into that, but suffice it to say that around May 10th or so, in the area around the Sorbonne, the Paris University, and I mean the area not just around it, but this, a square mile or two, there were street fights with police, and there were barricades by the dozens, so that they actually had more than a square mile barricaded off. And when I use the term street fighting, you may be thinking, oh, is this like Occupy Oakland? No, it isn't like Occupy Oakland because it was fighting. It was not just shouting at the police and throwing a bottle. And I'm not saying this to recommend it. I'm just saying that they were actually fighting the police. They were throwing paving stones, which at the time the street had paving stones, and you could just dig them up and throw them. Again, I'm not saying was this wise or was this da-da-da. Whatever it was, the French people at that time could relate to it. And why I'm saying don't jump to conclusions here is that France at that time, or Europe at that time, had a somewhat different attitude about police. Remember that World War II was not that far back. The Gestapo and things like that had very bad image. And so police, however brutal they may be, and then the French police are certainly brutal, were not carrying around all the stuff that we see in Oakland and so on. And if there was fighting, a large part of the population would identify with the rioters. Again, for historical reasons in part, they might be. Anyway, there was more than a day in which there were actually fights. If you call brick throwing fights, it's not deadly maybe, but it's significant. And then little by little, the police won and came in, and they arrested about 700 or 800 people who were involved in the rioting. But the media coverage of this was such that everybody all over France, or anyway, an awful lot of people, sympathized with the rioters and did not like the police. And it was such that the de Gaulle government pulled back the police. I mean, they realized, I guess you could say it was a little bit analogous to October 25th, I guess it was, in Oakland, 25th or 26th, that it was such that the police had such bad press, and there was such outrage about it, that they just pulled them back. And when they pulled them back, then all the people, I guess including people who had been arrested, were let go, converged in on the Sorbonne and occupied it. And the Sorbonne is a huge university. It would be like occupying Cal or something like that. And what they did then is they did not just have it for students. They invited everybody to come in and take part. So that was one of the interesting things that made a difference compared with previous student things that you may have heard about. Because other people could come in and they had a general assembly in the Sorbonne, I don't know, some large building there that could hold thousands of people. And in that kind of chaotic situation, other people started occupying other buildings. There wasn't a big deal about Occupy buildings yet. It was just that they thought it was a good idea. The buildings were empty. You could take it over if you had some use for it. So different radical groups would just take over buildings. People in other cities in France started taking over their universities, their buildings, in various ways. And in that kind of chaotic process around May 14th, 15th, 16th, one of the enragés, in the GAs, they were going to elect committees to take care of different things, as is necessary when you've got thousands of people. But the idea was that the occupation committee would be re-elected every day. You'd have a new election every day. And there would be, I don't know, they had 8 or 10 people on the committee. So they had spontaneously, like in the free speech movement, when they were around that police car, they decided to have a 3-minute time that anybody could speak. It's interesting that spontaneously they came up with the same time limit. And so people would speak about what they proposed to do, and then after a bunch of this, they had an election for who was going to be on our committee to sort of coordinate things till tomorrow. And René Rizel, who was one of the enragés, was one of those elected on the basis of his program was total direct democracy in the Sorbonne and calling for occupation of the factories and formation of workers' councils. And so on the basis of that, he was one of the people elected. And once these people were elected, a lot of the ones who were elected just drifted away. And Rizel and 1 or 2 others were left there. And so that day, following the mandate that they felt they had, they issued a statement, which I will read here. Like a press release, I guess you would say. Comrades, considering that the Sud Aviation factory at Nantes, that's an airplane factory, has been occupied for 2 days by the workers and students of that city, and that the movement is spreading to several factories, and here they list a few factories in Paris and so on. The Sorbonne Occupation Committee calls for the immediate occupation of all the factories in France and the formation of workers' councils. Comrades, spread and reproduce this appeal as quickly as possible. May 16th, 3:30 p.m. So, under most circumstances, a statement like that would be considered delirious. But in this, and in fact, many of the people, even present, probably consider, they said, what, we just got here and you're talking about the whole country. But what you'll notice that how they phrased this, it says, considering that people have already started this. So it's starting to seem a little more realistic here, and it's not something we just came up with out of our heads. We're calling on this. Well, the fact is that within 2 weeks of that appeal, more than 10 million workers had occupied just about every workplace in France. And France is lots, you know, it only has 50 million people at that time. You know, in other words, essentially, this is most of the workers in France, at least in the big factories and stuff like that. So that's just to say that this appeal was not just pulling something out of their head. It was like, it was based on something that they saw developing. Now, when these factories became occupied, the process was complex. But one of the things that was not very complex was the role of the unions. The unions were totally against it. And the Communist Party and the Socialist Party were totally against this. The Communist Party in particular was rabidly denouncing this whole movement that I've been talking about, saying it was the work of provocateurs and that workers should responsibly pay no attention to these anarchistic things that were going on. And there are reasons for that, which I won't go into too far, but except to say that these bureaucratic, hierarchical institutions sense when they are being challenged. Needless to say, a movement with everybody occupying all the factories leaves the union nowhere. Leaves a union nowhere, and similarly a party that's claiming to lead the proletariat, etc. So in the case of the Communist Party, they were just vehemently against it and are on record in numerous ways. The unions in the factories were also against it, but they had to be a little more subtle about it because they're closer to the workers. And so when this stuff started happening, like, hey, are we going to occupy our factories? Then the union bureaucrats say, oh, we want to express our solidarity with blah, 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 or, you know, some kind of meaningless thing there. And anyway, one way or the other, they sort of put the brakes on, but they also had to pretend to be part of it. Like, oh yeah, maybe we'll call a one-day symbolic general strike, you know, against de Gaulle or something. Well, this had nothing to do with de Gaulle. That was totally irrelevant. But anyway, so if you can picture, you know, the things going on here, just as a little side note, this book, which is mostly about Vietnam, the author of this book, whose autobiography I translated, moved to France, and there's a little bit in this book later on where he became a worker in France, and he has an account of a factory occupation during May '68. And you can see in that not a whole lot went on there. They were occupying the factory, they were not working, and they were there every day, but they were also kind of neutralized. They were just sort of waiting. You know, the unions still had the, you know, let's call a meeting, let's call an assembly, and then the unions would formulate a questionnaire. Do we want to do this, or do we want to do this, and so on. So you can kind of see in there how they managed to kind of tamp it down. So the end result is that you have millions of workers in their factories striking, and they're in the factories mostly rather than just staying at home, so the factories can't have scabs and all this. But then the question is where to go from here, or how do we organize this? And as long as the factories are isolated and the unions are still more or less in control, they're the ones who have the telephones. Bear in mind, this is before cell phones and stuff like this. If you tried to call a factory, they would, you'd get the union. If you assume you didn't get the bosses, and the bosses, of course, had already left. So each workers in each factory didn't really know too much what was going on in another factory, and the unions kept the gates locked. They said, oh, we don't want provocateurs to get in here. Actually, what they